I don't think writers are born. I think they are made. I think circumstance makes you a writer. In my case, it was a childhood in which I was required to be an observer. I was required to step back because we moved from place to place, and I was obliged to figure out how to fit in into a new group, a new school, a new community. I was obliged to learn to observe, to figure out how to fit in.
I can't really imagine a born writer. I mean, you have to learn to read and to write. People teach us generally to read and write. I imagine there are a few brilliant souls who learn to read on their own, pretty well untutored. There are a few people like that, but most of us have to be taught the basics, and then from there, of course, we learn from others, whether it's formal instruction in the classroom or whether it's just reading writers that we think are great. We learn from others.
Yeah, I think I got all my storytelling skills from my mum, because she always used to tell me all the stories of things that were going on or our family life in a very detailed way, when we were just hanging out and cooking together or doing domestic chores like ironing. And so that aspect of storytelling is very valuable to me, just the telling of the story in the verbal way.
Both my parents were journalists, which probably doesn't hurt. But the thing that made a difference, because I wasn't very aware of their professions, and my mom didn't work when I was growing up, was there were just books everywhere. That was like the function of your house, was to provide meals and hold up the books.
I think it's my heritage also. Maxine Hong Kingston once talked about her mother giving her talk stories, telling her stories, and I think it's part of our upbringing to hear a lot of stories. My mother was from Hong Kong. I heard about, her growing up in Hong Kong, about my grandmother. I think a lot of that has to do with what goes into the books today, my books in particular, and the stories. I think we're a whole generation of Asian American authors too, who weren't able to voice their stories except within the last 20 years, if we really think about it in terms of being published. So a lot of us are going back and telling our mothers and our grandmothers and our great-grandmothers' stories. So what appears a lot in our books is this feeling of storytelling, because I think we were raised in that vein of hearing the stories.
I was always good at writing at school. And I always had a love of reading from a very early age. So it's always been a kind of natural thing for me to fall into. So I think I think I was sort of born a writer as opposed to being made a writer.
A lot of people want to be writers, and they feel that they are writers, and that somewhere in them there is this writer who's going to emerge and be very successful. But they're not, and they never will be. And they can work very hard. They might be able to write competently, but they just don't seem to have a gift.
I do think writers are born, just as anybody is born to what they can do. Not to bring it down to the level of Star Trek, but when Kirk once asked Spock how his young cadets would respond in a crisis situation in The Wrath of Khan, Spock said, "As with all living things, each according to his gifts." We all have certain gifts genetically, and we all have certain deficits genetically. Writing is one of those things that, to a very large degree, you do have to be born to.
The times that I've been teaching writing, I have 20 students that are working on a novel. Maybe one will create a good novel. And they all write beautifully. They know how to write. And I can teach them a few things about the writing, but I cannot teach them suspense, tension, tone, what to withhold and when to give it, if you are going to give it to the reader, how to play with the imagination of the reader, what is the highlight of the story. Sometimes what you omit is much more important than what you write, and that is so important. So it's in a way it's a dance. So everybody can dance, but dance beautifully, not everybody can.
you cannot teach someone to be creative. So you're born with that creativity. And then it's the way your life evolves that makes you a writer, makes you use that natural creativity you're born with and turn into a writer or not.
I actually started in my college work in film, and I thought that was the process in which I wanted to tell the story, visually seeing it on the screen. It wasn't until I took a film course that I realized how complicated it was. That, the story has to be technically put on the screen. It wasn't free-flowing, and there wasn't the narrative that I had hoped for. So I moved over to the writing department. And so in that case, I think you're born with that need to tell the story, but your craft is learned as you take courses. The more you read, the more you write.
I know many people who were born with a great deal of natural talent who have never yet really succeeded with their writing because they haven't put in the work. And at the same time, I know writers who might not be the most gifted, not put myself in this category, but who've worked really hard and have, had some success with it.
You can't teach people how to write. You can't teach whatever that innate charge or mystery or obsession or, inspiration. And people have to find their own sources of that, and people have to find their own rhythms and their own voices. And I don't think you can teach that at all. So in that sense, writers are born, I think. But I think that heaps of people have a writerly sensibility. They have a creative, outlook, and yet they never actually turn that into something which is actualized. And so I think, discipline and luck, timing, circumstance, training, practice, diligence, all of those things play a large role in getting, a book out.